Since 2010, Seth has done full-time pro-life work and currently serves as the Director of Training for Created Equal, where his passion is to activate a radical generation. So, Seth, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you everyone for being here today. It truly is an honor to be here to celebrate with you and to partner with you, especially in light of the news this summer, which I know you're all aware of. The news from Sharonville, very exciting to see the clinic close there. And I certainly know we're all looking forward to the day that such decisions like that will ring in courtrooms around the nation. As the clinics close, as babies are rescued and women and men are prevented the pain of carrying their burdens. Until that day, right, we're here. We're here, we pray, we stand, we counsel, we reach out. That's what we must do. So thank you so much for what you are doing. It's an honor to be with preborn defenders like you. 7 years ago, I was on a train chugging its way westward across Poland, and in my hands I had a parchment paper journal into which I poured memories and musings and poetry. That journal was my companion during the year that I lived in France, doing French teaching, as Debbie told you, teaching English in France part-time. But I was in Poland, and normally with my journal, my ink was normally free-flowing, but on that day, the ink in my pen turned to ice, because I was struggling to process what I had just seen. For I was on the train away from Auschwitz. And so on that train, thinking about what I had seen at this infamous site still standing today in testament to what was arguably the epicenter of Hitler's genocidal plans, a lot of things were in my mind that day. For as the dusty textbooks from my middle school came to stark reality, I was shocked by what has struck so many others who visited that site. I was struck by how inexhaustible the Nazi project was of dehumanization when people came to Auschwitz. Physical, psychological, familial. As I focused that day on the train of the pain of the Holocaust, what I was not aware of that day as I was sitting on that train was that 500 miles from me, where I was, in Munich, Germany, there was a plaque. And if I could have seen that plaque, I would have understood that Hitler's plan was even more pervasive than what I had seen at Auschwitz. Because Hitler, being the wise leader that he was, not only eliminated the undesirables of his nation, he also focused very intently on indoctrinating those who were desirable, those who he did want in his future. Propaganda of the Hitler Youth, the program that Hitler used to transform young Germans into Nazi believers, programmed and transformed these young Germans into racists, into Nazi believers. And those who dissented from his program of the Hitler Youth were punished. In 1942, a few youth did break free from the Hitler Youth to form an underground anti-Nazi resistance movement called the White Rose. And when they were later punished, the German Corps who punished them in their proceedings said this: "One has to be ashamed that there's a class of this sort in a German humanistic gymnasium." They couldn't believe that German students had actually broken free from their propaganda and that they had dissented and were fighting against them. And it's in honor of these dissenters that the plaque at the University of Munich still can be seen today. So today, to us, 40 years, over 4 decades after Roe versus Wade, we're standing here at the site where the undesirables are being eliminated every week behind us. And as they're being eliminated, the same thing is happening, that as the abortion advocacy is destroying those they don't want in their future, they're also very carefully indoctrinating those they do want. And that's why we are here, because today we are looking now to the future of our children, our preborn children we want to have in America, the future of men and women, again, carrying burdens from past abortions. We're thinking about the future of this week. Who's going to come here to pray? Who will be here standing on the sidewalk? Reaching out to women, and also as a public witness to those driving by. We're also thinking of the future of our movement. And so today, as we're trying to be effective as part of the 40 Days campaign, as we're trying to be effective as part of the pro-life movement, I think we can learn something from the White Rose, because they were the unique people inside the German indoctrination system who saw through the propaganda. And so in the same way that they saw through the Nazi propaganda, today I'd like to take a look at some of the pro-choice propaganda, how they are targeting our youth, how they're targeting Americans, and how we should respond as we are out here praying and as we're having one-on-one conversations with people that we know. So today, briefly in my time, I'd like to look at 3 trends that I think are present in abortion advocacy today and how we ought to respond as a movement. And the first one is a trend of messaging. There is a very clear message that the abortion industry is continuing to send and is getting stronger, I think, in sending today, and that is one of normalizing abortion, making this, what happens behind these closed doors, seem like a normal thing that every woman in her life should experience if she is in a difficult spot. Now, veterans in the pro-life movement will say, well, that's not new, and that's true. Normalizing abortion is a project that many abortion advocates have long engaged in. But I think efforts to that are in more frequency today, if not in more fervor. Last week, just this past week, in These Times, an independent magazine, there was a piece by Sadie Doyle, and the piece was called, "Abortion Isn't a Necessary Evil, It's Great." Doyle in the piece decries pro-abortion rhetoric that has been tonally negative, treating abortion as something that ought to be apologized for. She writes, "Progressives have long apologized for being right, but we don't have to. Abortion saves lives, improves lives, and makes for a stronger society. The facts are decisively on our side," she writes. Now, it'd be tempting to say that she's just a far outlier. However, the messaging that I think we're seeing of abortion advocates have long been running toward that goal. 4 years ago, Aubrey and I did pack up our Indiana apartment to move to the Buckeye State, and yes, hooray for that. But as we were doing so, I remember seeing on Twitter this trend of women taking photos of themselves, women of all ages, all backgrounds, wearing a simple t-shirt with a simple message saying, "I had an abortion." The message was clear. Abortion is something for all women, of all ages, and anyone should have it. It is normal. Just a couple months ago, the raunchy comedy Obvious Child hit the theaters. It was billed, I've not seen it, but I know of it. It was billed as the abortion comedy, and it showed a 20-something Donna who gets pregnant, is dumped by her boyfriend, and then has an abortion. And the filmmaker, Gillian Robespierre, was clear about her goals in the film. In an interview with the Daily Telegraph, she said her goal was this: "We wanted to make a movie where a woman goes through an abortion without shame or regret." She wanted to show a stigma-free abortion, she said, something that according to her had not yet been done. And before Obvious Child hit the big screen, Emily Letts hit the small screen. Does anyone remember Emily Letts? She has a video that's now famous on social media. On Vimeo, it garnered over a million views. In the film, Emily Letts purportedly shows her abortion. She said she was tired of women saying everyone feels guilty, and she wanted to show a positive abortion. So if you watch the film, you can see her face, supposedly before, during, and after the abortion. And in the film, she says, "I don't feel sad. I feel in awe of the fact that I can make a baby." And just this week, I read a piece by Sasha Issenberg about Planned Parenthood sending out women who've had abortions to go knock on strangers' doors in Los Angeles to share their positive abortion story. Dave Flesher, one of the organizers, he says this was their goal. The anti-abortion side has made people think to speak up and say something positive about abortion means you risk disapproval. And he wanted to show that that's not always the case. So they're sending out women to go knock on your door and say, "Hey, I had an abortion. This is normal." Now, I don't think the abortion advocates have been successful across the board in normalizing abortion yet. But Create Equal, we go onto college campuses and high schools to talk to students about abortion, and I can tell you one thing I seldom hear anymore is President Clinton's old line of safe, legal, and rare. Why? Because abortion advocates know that to win the cultural battle, this must not be something seen as rare, but something normal, something common. Everyone should be free to walk through those doors and have no problem with what happens when they do so. So what should we do? As culture sheds the stigma of abortion and tries to make it seem normal? I think Emily Letts in her video, she gave the answer. Because in her video she says, when she comments on what she did, an article commenting on her video later, Emily said this: "We talk about abortion so much, and yet no one really knows what it looks like." And she said that she showed abortion by showing her face on the video camera. But there's a reason the camera did not show the face of the other person involved, the victim. Because Emily knows that if we had seen her baby, that would not have seemed normal to us. So we don't have to dream up ways to stigmatize abortion. All we have to do as culture paints a facade of normalcy over abortion is merely pull that facade off and show the victims behind the curtain. And that's why when we go onto a college campus, we're not alone. We bring with us photographs of the victims, because when you look into the face of a dead child, for that matter, the face of a lynched African American or an emaciated Jew at Auschwitz, it becomes really hard to point to that and say that is normal. Victim photography is one of the strongest tools we have in our toolbox when culture tries to normalize any crime. And it's not the only tool. I mean, we can also use our language. Francis Chan, in a video last year with John Enzer and John Piper, talked about even the words that we use sometimes hide the reality. We say abortion as a shorthand, but what do we really mean? We mean decapitating, dismembering, disemboweling. We mean burdening women with pain. We should describe the reality so that people know what we're really talking about and not hiding behind what they have now made as normal. So the first trend is normalizing. The second trend I want to consider this morning is consistency. Just last month, Jamie, my colleague, and Josh, we walked onto the Ohio State University's campus, because now we're good Buckeyes, and we were doing outreach there with our signs showing living babies in the womb and also babies killed by abortion, also women who, like Lakeisha Wilson, who just recently was killed by a legal abortion in America, showing the victims of abortion and asking people, what do you think about this? To create respectful dialogue and also share the gospel with those who are carrying burdens. And about midway through the outreach, a nicely dressed lawyer came up with her own sign standing by our signs, and her sign read, "A woman's health is a woman's choice." Now I walked up to her and said, "So what is your opinion? What do you think about abortion? Is it ever wrong at any stage of pregnancy?" And she said, "No." And I wanted to find some common ground with her to build a conversation, to try to come to some agreement. And so I said, "So what about killing a baby 2 minutes after birth? Is that okay?" And she said, "It would depend on the medical circumstances." She continued, "You're asking me to blanketly state whether I believe it's right or wrong to directly kill an infant after she's been taken from her mother's womb, and I'm telling you I can't make that decision. I'm not in the operating room." If the first trend of normalizing abortion means we ought to boldly expose it, this second trend is, in my opinion, potentially one of our biggest opportunities, but also our biggest loss if we fail. Because this is the trend of abortion advocates becoming consistent with their rhetoric, even when the results are shocking. Now again, the veterans in the battle will say, hey, long before you met that lawyer at OSU, Peter Singer was preaching infanticide in his book, Practical Ethics, decades ago, and that's true. But today I think we're starting to see the fruit of his years and other professors' years of teaching these ideas to students who now have internalized them and are communicating them to others. The lawyer at OSU, for example, is not the only one I've encountered who accepts infanticide along with abortion. When Haskell's Sharonville Clinic was ordered closed by the judge down in Cincinnati, I was there that day on the streets, and that day a NARAL activist told me that it should be a mother's choice whether or not to kill her born baby laying on her stomach attached by umbilical cord. In downtown Columbus, one young man said he wouldn't make a big fuss about it if someone wanted to kill newborns. And I'll never forget the University of Minnesota when a young girl said we should kill toddlers with Down syndrome because they'll be a drain upon society. I freely admit to you, that's anecdotal evidence. But my point is not that all abortion advocates accept infanticide. My point is some do, and sometimes people are accepting it when they listen to them. Or here's another example of chilling consistency with abortion rhetoric. Last year, Salon.com carried a piece by Mary Elizabeth Williams titled, "So What If Abortion Ends Life?" And in that piece, Williams admitted that a fetus is a human being, living like you and me. But she said, here's the complicated reality in which we all live. All life is not equal, and therefore it's okay to kill some humans. The danger is clear. These messages, infanticide, human inequality, are consistent with pro-choice rhetoric. And as others internalize them, it makes it difficult for us because these are logically sound ideas. The premises are evil. Because these are people that are dispensing with the lie that there's some difference between my toddler and the preborn children dying every week at this clinic. But refusing to reject abortion, they accept the unthinkable, infanticide, human inequality. But I do think that gives us a great opportunity. This is not all depressing today. There is good news. Because while some professors, activists, and students are biting the bullet and accepting these shocking ideas to protect abortion, I think these ideas still ring false to the average man on the street. If you go to the nearby mall or the shopping center and ask, what do you think about infanticide to the average American? I think they'll tell you they think it's wrong. Or ask them, do you believe in human equality? I think they'll say they believe in it. So we have an open window, I think, where abortion advocates are becoming increasingly consistent with their rhetoric, while the conclusions thereof, infanticide, inequality, are still out of step with common culture. So when we're praying here at 40 Days and someone stops by and asks, what are you doing? If we talk about the connections between what's happening here and infanticide, euthanasia, and human inequality, I think we can build some common ground that will help us change minds. That's one thing that I tried to do this spring when I was engaged in debate with the Purdue professor, Dr. Ralph Webb, about abortion. I asked him in cross-examination what he thought about sex trafficking. And that might have seemed off topic, but Dr. Webb had put forth a moral relativistic ethic. He said, what's true for you may not be true for other people. So I wanted to see if he'd be consistent with that idea when it comes to other crimes like sex trafficking. So I asked his opinion of it. Is it wrong for all peoples, all times? Or is it okay for some people? What did he say? Dr. Webb said, in some countries, it could be moral, ethical to kidnap women and enslave them that way. Now, did he change his mind when I asked him that? Probably not. But there were students listening in that audience that night. And when he condoned sex trafficking, surely some of the students sympathetic to his views felt inner turmoil, seeing that consistency with the pro-choice ethic leads to accepting something they don't want to accept, human trafficking, because they know that strikes against the law that God wrote on all of our hearts. So as we look to the future, not only of this campaign and of 40 Days for Life generally, but to our movement in America, we have an opportunity to start engaging in conversations, drawing connections between the inner moral intuitions we all have from God's law in our hearts, and the sharp contrast between that and the logical, dangerous conclusions of abortion advocacy. Second trend is consistency. And the third, making disciples. In 2012, then President of NARAL Pro-Choice America, Nancy Keenan, shocked many Americans when she talked about what she called the intensity gap between young pro-life Americans and young pro-choice Americans. And she thought she saw youth opposed to abortion having a lot more fire and passion than those in favor of it. So her answer to that was to pass the baton on to a younger generation, and she made good on that promise. In 2013, younger Elise Hogue assumed leadership of NARAL. Now, more important than Keenan's words of this intensity gap, in my opinion, is her example of actively recruiting her replacement. I am not recommending that we follow suit and just pass on the torch, quit, and give up our roles to younger people just because they're younger. Because we truly live in a youth-obsessed nation, and I think we could fall into the trap of saying just because that person's young, they should be the leader, and demographics don't matter most. What matters most is wisdom and leadership. Being young is not a requirement for defending preborn children, and so as we're recruiting our friends to come to 40 Days, we're looking for anyone, youths, veterans, non-youths, anyone, should be part of this battle that affects all of us. But instead, it's Keenan's awareness of the need to replicate herself and make a disciple of someone else that I think is important for us. We have to be, if we want this battle to go beyond each of us, we have to be thinking, well, who's coming behind us? Who will keep coming to this clinic and praying once I'm gone? Who will keep coming once I'm no longer leading the 40 Days campaign? When I consider what made Aubrey and I take the risk of starting full-time pro-life work, I think there are many things that encouraged us. Simple knowledge of what's happening behind these doors, apologetic teaching we were receiving from other people. But honestly, I think what pressed us forward the most was relationships with people who mentored us. Starting with our parents who cultivated us a love for other people, born and preborn. It wasn't just knowledge for me that the movement existed that made me want to be part of it. It was hours spent listening to people telling me their stories from the rescue movement from years ago that made me dream of a chance to have a role. And it wasn't just organizing apologetics camps that gave me a chance to see how I could play a role. It was relationships with the Right to Life board I was a part of that made me see I really could do this. And so as we look to our future as a campaign, as a movement, we can't expect arguments or ideas alone to inspire our replacements. We have to be diligent to cultivate in others, to cultivate in youths and non-youths a passion, so they would bring whatever, and then bring what God has given us to the table as mentors as we work with them. So, if there are students here, or if you know students, what we should encourage them to do is look for someone who they think is a hero in the movement, and go ask them, will you be my mentor? And if you're a volunteer, if you're a leader in the pro-life movement, look for someone you know. Doesn't matter what age they are, look for someone you know who has a passion, and so tell them it's time for them to learn how to prepare to replace you. Because looking to our future means discipling and shaping. And sometimes, simple gestures, as you are looking to the future, all of us, know that simple gestures sometimes leave lasting impressions. When I was a sophomore in high school, I prepared to give my very first anti-abortion presentation. And as I was preparing that speech, when the day of the speech came, there was an adult friend of mine who came to my class to listen to what I had to say. And I can only remember two things about that speech. One, that the administration censored my pictures of preborn babies killed by abortion. And two, that a man who barely knew me, Mike Spencer, showed interest to come to my class and listen. Years later, Debbie told you that he became my father-in-law. But it was that action, as a virtual unknown person to me, it was that action by this unknown person that put a stamp of approval on my anti-abortion efforts that I'll never forget and made me feel validated as a young preborn defender. People here are keenly aware of their need to recruit, train, and replace, and so must we be. When I think back to that cold spring day in Poland years ago, I'm haunted by the fact that over 1 million men, women, and children dreamed of taking the train that I was on, the train leading away from Auschwitz. But what was easy for me was an unfathomable, never achieved, never realized dream for them. And listening to the clacking of the train tracks, I felt the weight of man's evil. I wish there was some way that I could have aided these humans in need, but that's impossible. We're separated by time. Still, sometimes I fantasize of what it would have been like if they could have known that hundreds of miles away in Munich there was a resistance inside the German Empire, not just outside with the Allies, but actually inside the Student White Rose movement, the underground movement, which had seen through the propaganda aimed at the German society and was sending shockwaves through the Nazis' power structure with their efforts. I dream of how it might have encouraged these vulnerable men and women to know someone somewhere had not bought into the lies. Today, I think we all feel the weight of the evil here, of the children who this week will die, the men and women this week who will walk away and years later be carrying burdens from what happened. And I wonder what it could be like for the preborn children if they knew that feet away, not 500 miles away, but less than a mile away, on this sidewalk, there is someone praying who cares, someone who has not bought into the lies, and someone who's trying to rescue them. That's why you're here. But we, small and mighty, we are not enough to get the job done. When Mark Harrington, Created Equal's executive director, first recruited me, he said, if at the end of his tenure there is not a long line of preborn defenders following him, he's failed. And I see his point. Because if, as an organization, our goal is to go change minds on campus, I'm surely not enough. I can't make it to all the American campuses. I can't make it to all the Ohio campuses in a year. Instead, I have to be recruiting, training, and sending out others to do the job. And that's why we organize Justice Rise. We go on the road with students to equip them and then send them out to go do the work. And the same is true for everyone here. Whether you come to pray, whether you are counseling women, whether you are lobbying for legislation, or whether you're leading a group on a campus somewhere, we must be actively looking to the future and preparing others. We must be, in order to do so, seeing through the propaganda today in the same way the outward-thinking White Rose saw through the Nazi propaganda. But that's not easy, because the abortion industry is clearly looking to our future as well. They're targeting Americans with the message that abortion is normal. They are becoming boldly consistent with their rhetoric, and they are keenly aware of their need to recruit. So we in turn must boldly expose the abnormality of abortion, make known the terrifying conclusions of their rhetoric, and do the hard work of discipling the next generation. For if we do, then perhaps we will see more dissenters from the propaganda of abortion advocacy. Perhaps more preborn defenders will stand up in the spirit of Germany's White Rose resistance, and then, well, I don't know for sure if we will end abortion because I can't predict the future. But I do know at the end of each of our lives, we will see our history dotted with stories of children rescued from the knife of abortion, and men and women who have felt the healing power of Christ's work on the cross. I don't know about you. When the time comes that I'm not looking to the future anymore, but looking to my history, that is exactly what I want to see.
Yeah.
Thank you.